Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. I didn't immediately notice that my heart had sped up as we approached the house. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. The tall fence, the old flower beds with wilting plants, and the same scent of freshly cut grass. I was squeezing Oliver's hand as we stood at the doorstep. We had arrived for yet another family celebration, but for some reason I felt uneasy, though I couldn't immediately pinpoint why. Everything looked the same, but the dull ringing inside me grew stronger with every passing moment. "Are you okay?" Oliver asked, slightly turning his head toward me. I nodded. Yes, of course. Everything was fine. It was just a house, just another evening. But something stirred inside me, like water in a glass, when you suddenly move it from one place to another. Oliver didn't notice the change in my mood. He never notices things like that. He doesn't have the habit of looking deeper than what's on the surface. Maybe that's why I was drawn to someone who saw a little more. We entered the house, and immediately, familiar voices surrounded us like an invisible web. My mother, smiling and busy organizing the evening, bustled around with trays and glasses. Everything was just as usual. I wanted to merge with this familiar hustle and bustle, but I couldn't. Something was stopping me. And then I saw him. Logan. He stood by the window at the far end of the room, holding a glass of wine. It seemed as though he had always been there, as if he were a part of the house, rooted into the walls and furniture. But I knew that wasn't true. Logan didn't belong here. He never had. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen him this close in a long time. After he married my mother, we rarely saw each other, but every time we did, it was jarring, like someone forcing me to look at what I'd long tried to ignore. He lifted his eyes, and our gazes met. In that moment, I felt the ground beneath me shift slightly, as if someone had turned a key in a lock and opened a door long sealed shut. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that it was just a formal meeting at a family dinner, nothing more. But Logan looked at me as though he knew everything, as though we both did. Oliver was saying something, laughing next to me. I nodded and smiled absent-mindedly, though I barely heard his words. Logan stepped closer, and his approach felt inevitable, like a tidal wave about to engulf you. Oliver didn't notice the movement. He never notices. "Hello, Grace," Logan said, his voice steady. But I heard that note, the one no one else would have caught. The tension inside me tightened like a string pulled to its limit. "Hello, Logan," I replied, feeling my heart begin to pound faster. His name on my lips sounded strange, like a forbidden word I shouldn't have spoken aloud. Unaware of anything, Oliver cheerfully nodded to Logan and continued chatting with someone else. I felt the world around me shrink, leaving just the two of us. Logan stood too close, too familiar, as if time hadn't passed, as if there hadn't been his marriage to my mother, nor my attempts to forget. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, but I heard every word. "Thank you," I replied, trying to sound indifferent, though I knew it was futile. There was something between us, invisible but very real, like an unseen hand tightening around my throat. I avoided his gaze for as long as I could, but with each passing moment, it became harder. "How are you?" he continued, as if testing the waters, cautiously brushing the boundaries we both knew. "I'm fine," I replied automatically, though inside, everything was screaming. There was no fine. There was tension, guilt, and the urge to flee from this room, yet also the desire to stay and find out what would happen next. Oliver moved away to another group of guests, leaving us alone in this strange dance of pretense. I hated myself for being unable to resist. Everything I had hidden inside for so long began to seep to the surface, like water leaking through cracks in a dam. Logan stepped even closer. He didn't touch me, but I felt his presence, like the warmth of a fire threatening to ignite at any moment. I tried to gather my thoughts, to find a reason to leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. "We haven't spoken in a while," he said, his voice so quiet it seemed as though only I could hear it. "Yes, it's been a while," I replied, feeling a shiver run through me. I wanted to step away, but something inside kept me near him. There was so much unsaid between us, so many emotions left unspoken. I tried to hold it together, but I knew everything was falling apart. This evening marked the beginning of something far more complicated than I could have imagined. Logan looked at me, and in his gaze, I saw what I had always feared to acknowledge, the past we both couldn't forget. Laughter and conversation echoed around the room, but it all seemed distant. I knew one thing. This evening was the beginning of the end of my peace. When my mother asked me to help prepare for the next family dinner, I didn't expect to end up alone with Logan. Oliver was busy at work, as always, and it seemed like the most natural thing for me to go grocery shopping. But when my mother suggested that Logan accompany me, I felt a strange tension. I nodded, not knowing how to refuse. Wasn't it a normal request? We were sitting in the car, and the world outside the windows seemed to move in slow motion, like in a movie. Logan was driving, and I stared at the road, avoiding his gaze. He drove confidently, as always, but the silence between us felt too loud. "How are things?" His voice suddenly broke the quiet, like the click of a lock. I flinched but quickly tried to hide it. "Everything's fine," I answered. Fine. What else could I say? Inside me, everything was far from fine. The awkwardness was palpable, like every breath filled the air with a heaviness that was impossible to ignore. He gave a short nod, not asking any more questions. But that brief glance was enough to make me feel something shift inside. His eyes always had a way of finding what I tried to hide. They had always been too perceptive. "Oliver works a lot, huh?" Logan spoke again, and there was something more in his voice than just casual interest. It was a soft jab, as if he wanted to test my reaction. "Yes, he's busy, as usual." I forced myself to speak evenly. Why did talking about Oliver suddenly feel so difficult? These were normal things I had said before, but at that moment, every word felt false. "It's hard, I know," Logan said, and there was a hint of understanding in his voice. He wasn't looking at me, but it felt as if he could see everything I had been trying so hard to hide from even myself. We both knew what was really being discussed, but neither of us said it out loud. We pulled up to the shopping center. Outside, nothing seemed to have changed. The same storefronts, bright signs, and people busy with their shopping. But inside me, everything was different. I knew I couldn't just run errands as if this were a normal day. Something hung between us like a dense fog. We got out of the car and headed toward the entrance. I tried to focus on the shopping list my mother had given me, quickly stepping ahead, trying to keep my distance from Logan. But he easily caught up with me, as if it were the most natural thing. The air around him felt heavier. Every movement was saturated with that silent tension I couldn't explain. "You know, the last time we saw each other, everything was different." His voice broke into my thoughts, and I turned my head toward him. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on a store window, but I knew this conversation wasn't random. "Different?" I felt a wave of unease rise inside me. What did he mean? What exactly had changed? "Yes, we've both changed," he said, and a faint smile passed across his face. But it was full of subtext. He wasn't talking about age or appearance. It was something more. I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if he had touched something inside me I had long tried to hide. I didn't know what to say. The words got stuck in my throat, and I just kept walking, pretending nothing had happened. But my thoughts were swirling like stormy waves. I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong, but inside, everything screamed the opposite. When we entered the supermarket, I tried to distract myself by focusing on the groceries. Logan grabbed a cart and followed me calmly. We talked about trivial things, what vegetables to get, which juice to choose. On the surface, everything seemed calm, but each phrase felt like a mask, hiding deeper emotions beneath. "You're happy, right?" he asked suddenly, leaning closer as I was picking out vegetables. His voice was quiet, almost inaudible, but I felt those words cut through me like a knife. "What?" I froze, unsure how to respond. "With Oliver," he clarified, still looking at me with that calmness I couldn't quite grasp. There was strength in his eyes, and at the same time, a strange softness, as if he could see right through me. "Yes, of course," I replied automatically, but my voice betrayed me. Inside, everything flared up like a fire I had long been trying to extinguish. Why was he asking these questions? What did he want? Logan pulled back, slightly smiling, but in his gaze, I saw a shadow of doubt. And in that moment, I realized that he knew the truth. He knew that I no longer felt happy, that I had long lost the joy I once had with Oliver. I had never said it out loud, but Logan was reading me like an open book. We continued with the shopping, but the conversation between us was no longer superficial. Every word, every glance was filled with subtext. We both knew that this trip was more than just grocery shopping for a family dinner. When we finally returned to the car, I felt exhausted, as if I had spent the day hiding something important. Logan opened the door, and I sat in the passenger seat, not knowing how to deal with the growing feeling inside me. I felt his presence, his gaze, which seemed too close. We drove in silence, and it felt as though the air inside the car grew heavier with each passing kilometer. Logan didn't look at me, but I could feel his presence so intensely that it was as if his thoughts were piercing through me. This wasn't just an ordinary drive. Every conversation we had in the store, every glance we exchanged, had accumulated and now weighed on us like a heavy burden. I watched the buildings flash by the window. The mall was already behind us, and our next stop loomed ahead. But I could no longer focus on mundane things. Everything had changed. One question kept spinning in my mind. How did we end up here? And why did the silence between us say so much more than all our previous conversations? Grace. His voice broke my thoughts, and I turned sharply toward him. Logan still didn't take his eyes off the road, but I noticed how his fingers tightened their grip on the steering wheel. "We need to talk." I sighed. Conversations with him were always tense. I felt that somewhere deep in our words was a hidden truth we both avoided. But here it was, almost at the surface. "About what?" I pretended not to understand, even though I already knew the answer. "About us," he said calmly, but the word hung in the air like a hammer blow. He said us, as if it were something real, tangible, something that needed to be discussed. The car slowed down, and I realized we had already pulled into a parking lot. Logan parked in the shadow of the trees, far from the other cars, and for a moment, something clicked inside me. It was as if we were in a closed-off universe, a dark, hidden place where no one could see or hear us. "What do you mean?" I asked, though the answer was already forming inside me. I knew we were at the edge, and this was the moment where we either had to step forward or retreat. But there was no strength in me to retreat. He exhaled and finally turned toward me. His eyes met mine, and there was something inevitable in his gaze. It was as if we were standing on the brink of something monumental, unable to take that final step. "You feel it too, don't you?" His voice was hoarse, and it seemed like he could no longer keep it inside, as though his soul was aching from the weight he had been carrying. I didn't answer right away. Everything inside me was in turmoil. My body and mind were at war with each other. This shouldn't be happening. It was forbidden. I'm married, and he's married to my mother. This conversation, this moment, this choice, it was all too dangerous. "Logan," I tried to stop him, but my voice sounded weaker than I expected. He moved closer. His face was only inches from mine, and I could feel his breath becoming more uneven. I should have turned away. I should have shut the door on this situation before it became irreversible. But I couldn't. I sat there, frozen, unable to tear myself away from his gaze. I can't ignore it anymore, he said so quietly, as if afraid someone might hear, even though there wasn't a soul around. And I don't think you can either. His words shattered the last barrier I had built inside myself over the years. All those feelings I had tried to suppress suddenly poured out, like a bright light breaking through the darkness. I couldn't deny it. I felt it just as strongly as he did. We both knew it was wrong. This was a taboo that should never be broken. And yet, in that moment, in the silence and shadows of the parking lot, I couldn't pretend anymore. I closed my eyes for a second, as if hoping that would stop the storm inside me. But it only intensified everything I had been trying to suppress. When I opened my eyes again, Logan was even closer. And in that instant, I realized it was too late to change anything. My hand reached out to him on its own, as if my body was acting against my will. His fingers gently touched my cheek, and that simple gesture was filled with such depth, such power, that I felt the entire world fade away. I heard him whisper my name, and that was enough. It all happened in a flash, without words, without thought. Our lips met at the exact moment when we both realized we could no longer pretend. That kiss held more truth than all our previous conversations. It was an acknowledgement of what we had known for so long. It was a breakthrough. We crossed a line, beyond which there was no turning back. I felt his warmth, his closeness, and with each passing second, the feeling grew stronger that this moment had been inevitable. We both knew it was wrong. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. When the kiss ended, we both sat in silence, breathing heavily. Logan didn't pull away far. He was still close, and I could feel his gaze on me. "We shouldn't talk about this," I whispered, my eyes still fixed on his lips. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a plea. No, it was a desperate plea. Logan looked at me seriously, and in his eyes, I saw the same struggle. He nodded. "No one can know," he added. His voice was firm, but inside, I knew that this decision wouldn't stop us. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was the beginning of something much bigger. A few weeks had passed since that day in the parking lot. I could have called them ordinary, but the truth was, everything had changed. Every time I found myself alone with my thoughts, the realization hit me. The kiss wasn't an accident. We crossed a line, and there was no going back. Logan and I tried to act like nothing had happened, but there were too many unsaid words, hidden gestures, and loaded glances between us. Each time we found ourselves in the same room, whether it was at a family dinner or a chance encounter, the tension grew. It lingered in the air, invisible but undeniably present. We both felt it, but neither of us dared to speak of it. Things started to change a couple of days after that kiss. Logan called me. His voice was restrained, but I immediately knew this wasn't a casual call. He wanted to meet. Not by chance, not at a family gathering. He suggested we meet at his apartment. "Just to talk," he said. And here I was, standing in front of the door to his apartment, which he had rented while working in another city. The very thought of being here felt forbidden, wrong. And yet I couldn't refuse. These past few weeks had left me restless. Our glances, meetings, silent confessions. It was all driving me mad. I came home to Oliver, but in my mind, I was somewhere far away with Logan. Oliver suspected nothing. He was always busy, immersed in his own projects, which gave me time to hide behind my own excuses. I told him work was overwhelming, that I had to stay late or meet with colleagues. In reality, I was trying to justify my own escape from home. Logan opened the door, and his presence immediately filled the space. He stood before me, and in his eyes, I saw the same mixture of guilt and attraction that I felt inside. It wasn't just curiosity, not just desire. It was something deeper, something we both couldn't suppress. "Hi," he said softly, as if afraid to break the fragile silence that surrounded us. Hi, I replied, feeling my hands tremble. I didn't know what to say. Words felt unnecessary. We both knew why I was here. Logan's apartment was modest, minimalist. Nothing extra, just the essentials. It felt temporary, just like our relationship. But this place was our refuge, a space where no one could see us. Here, away from reality, we could be who we really were. We sat down on the couch, and silence hung between us again. It was strange, sitting next to someone you've known all your life, but at this moment, feeling him completely differently. Logan sighed and turned to me. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, he began, and I felt my heart tighten. He couldn't forget it either. Our kiss in the parking lot wasn't just an impulse, it was a moment of truth. So have I replied, unsure how to continue the conversation. Inside, I was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, desire, fear. I knew it was wrong, but somehow that made it all the more alluring. We have to be careful, Logan continued. No one can know about this. I nodded. Of course, no one could know. But did I even know how long I could keep this a secret? Every time I left Oliver with another excuse, I felt myself sinking deeper into this. Logan and I planned our meetings in secret, always choosing moments when no one could suspect us. Our meetings became regular. We didn't speak of it aloud, but each time I arrived at his apartment, I knew I was taking another step away from my life with Oliver. I looked at Logan and saw not just the man I had known since childhood, but the one who had changed my reality. We were both diving headfirst into this secret as if it were our salvation. Time passed, and each time I returned home, I felt myself distancing further from Oliver. He began to notice that I had changed. I saw the worry in his eyes, but I brushed it off. Just work, just tired, I would say. But work wasn't the cause. Logan was. He had filled my life in such a way that I could no longer think clearly. With each passing day, I felt our relationship with Logan crossing a point of no return. We both knew it, but neither of us was willing to take the first step back. A few weeks had passed since I started spending more time with Logan at his rented apartment. Our meetings became regular. At first, I felt awkward, making up excuses for Oliver, hiding my true feelings. But over time, it became a habit. Oliver was constantly busy with work, giving me the chance to slip away. But lately, something had changed. Oliver started asking more questions, paying closer attention to details. I began to notice how his questions were becoming more direct, though he still hesitated to talk about what was really bothering him. He asked seemingly innocent questions, but I saw the worry in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, I started to fear that he was onto something. One evening, Logan came over to our house. Mom had asked him to help with some family matters, which was a perfectly normal reason. I knew everything looked completely innocent, but inside, I was terrified. Our secret meetings started to feel too risky. When Logan walked in, I saw how Oliver looked up from his papers and gave us a sharp glance. It wasn't the calm, familiar look of a husband who had nothing to worry about. There was a sharpness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "Hey, Logan," Oliver said, putting down his pen and standing up from the table. His voice was too steady, like a string pulled taut. I felt the tension in the room spike immediately. "Hey," Logan replied, nodding slightly towards Oliver. He always kept his cool, as if nothing was happening, but I knew him too well. That calmness was just on the surface. Logan and I exchanged a quick glance, and that was enough to send a chill down my spine. Everything that had been happening between us suddenly felt dangerously close to being exposed. I quickly looked away, hoping Oliver hadn't noticed that fleeting look, but his gaze was so sharp I knew he had seen it. "Is everything all right?" Oliver asked, and the question wasn't directed so much at Logan as it was at me. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to answer. Everything all right? Inside, everything was screaming that it wasn't. I tried to smile, but I could feel my face betraying me. Of course, I quickly replied, looking away. I couldn't meet his eyes. Logan remained as calm as ever. He pulled out his keys and started talking about the errands that had brought him here. I was grateful for that because it shifted the conversation to a more practical tone, and the tension eased slightly. But Oliver didn't leave. He continued standing there, watching our every move. When Logan finally took the documents he needed, Oliver suddenly spoke again. Picking up some papers for Grace's mom? You've got quite a bit of business with her, huh? His tone was almost joking, but I caught something more, an underlying suspicion. Yeah, she asked me to pick up a few things, Logan replied, without giving anything away. But that didn't stop Oliver. His eyes lingered on my face for a moment, and I knew he was searching for answers. His gaze was too attentive, too focused on the little details. Strange that you've been dropping by so often lately. You didn't used to visit this much, Oliver continued, now sounding more insistent. There's been a lot going on with your family recently, Logan responded evenly, with a slight smirk, but I could feel the tension rising inside him too. At that moment, Oliver stepped closer, and his next question caught me off guard. Grace, why are you so tense? You've been acting weird ever since Logan walked in. It was the first direct hit. His words pierced me like a knife, and I felt everything inside me tighten. My face tensed up involuntarily, and I couldn't respond right away. I stood there, paralyzed, sensing Logan stiffen beside me. Oliver, what kind of question is that? Everything's fine. I'm just tired. My voice came out too fast, too defensive. I was trying to reassure him, but I knew he had noticed my reaction. Oliver frowned but stepped back, though the tension in the room didn't disappear. Logan nodded, trying to keep the conversation going as usual, but I could tell he understood how dangerous things had become. This moment could be the beginning of the end. When Logan finally left the house, Oliver stood still, arms crossed over his chest. I knew he was going to ask questions now, and I'd have to come up with new excuses. You're clearly nervous, Oliver said when I came back into the room. His voice was soft, but there was an underlying threat in it. I knew these weren't just words. I'm just tired. I had a lot of work, I replied, trying to sound indifferent. Grace, I'm not stupid. Something's off here. Too many coincidences. He looked at me, and I felt the fear inside me growing. Oliver, you're imagining things. I didn't know how else to defend myself. Maybe, he said slowly, as if testing his words. But if that's the case, the truth will come out sooner or later. His words left me frozen with fear. The rain tapped against the window, creating a monotonous backdrop that only amplified my internal tension. I sat in the car, parked in front of Logan's apartment, unable to make myself get out. My heart felt heavy, and my mind was swirling with thoughts bouncing between fear, guilt, and a faint hope that I could stop this. Today, I had to end it. Put an end to something that had started as a passionate infatuation, but had spiraled into chaos, tearing apart my marriage, my life, and, most importantly, myself. I sighed, closed my eyes for a moment to collect my thoughts, and finally steeled myself. I got out of the car, feeling how each drop of rain heightened the sense of inevitability. Every step toward the door felt like the last. Today, everything would change. Logan opened the door immediately, as if he had sensed my approach. He smiled, but his face shifted instantly when he saw the expression on mine. His calm demeanor vanished, replaced by concern. Grace, what's wrong? He asked, looking directly into my eyes. I couldn't answer right away. My heart clenched when I saw how he looked at me, with the care and attention that had always made me question everything, but I knew I had to do this. We need to talk, I said as I walked into the apartment. My words sounded like a verdict, and I saw him tense up. About what? Logan closed the door and stepped closer, his voice filled with worry. I could feel his gaze on me, intense, making it even harder to say what I had come to say. I stood in front of him, trying to gather my thoughts. This moment was inevitable, and I had to be strong. Logan, we have to stop. I can't do this anymore. We can't keep going, I said, trying to make my voice firm, but inside, everything was twisting in pain. These words needed to be said, but each one felt like it was tearing me apart. Stop? His voice trembled as he stepped closer, shock filling his eyes. Grace, are you serious? I couldn't hold his gaze, so I looked away. Every move he made, every emotion he showed, was throwing me off balance, making me doubt my decision. But I knew this was the only way out. Yes, I'm serious. I can't do this anymore. It's destroying me, destroying everything around me. Oliver's starting to suspect something, and I trailed off, feeling the words stick in my throat. I knew that if I didn't stop now, I would lose everything I had. Grace, listen. You can't just walk away like it's nothing. What we have is real. This isn't a mistake. It's not just some fling. Logan grabbed my hand, and his touch was warm but heavy, like a weight I could no longer bear. I looked at him, and his words hit me harder than I expected. I knew his feelings were real, that he wasn't just saying it. He believed in us, believed that somehow we could make it work. But I couldn't. I saw where this was leading, and for the first time, I realized that it was heading nowhere but destruction. Logan, I can't. I'm married. We don't have a future. These feelings are only tearing apart everything I have. I I can't betray Oliver any further. My words came out like a confession of guilt, something I had postponed for too long. Inside, I was torn apart. Part of me wanted to stay, to believe that we could somehow survive this, but reality was relentless. Do you love him? Logan suddenly asked, and I felt my heart stop. His voice was quiet, but there was bitterness in it. He knew that my answer would change everything. I froze for a moment, thinking about his question. Did I love Oliver? Or was it just habit, duty, responsibility? I had loved him once, but what about now? My feelings for him had been overshadowed by what I felt for Logan. But was that love? Or just an escape from what I feared in my own life? It doesn't matter, I finally answered, realizing that I didn't have a true answer. What matters is that I have to choose my family. It's the only right choice. Logan looked at me, and in his eyes, there was so much pain that I wished I could turn back time, change everything that had happened. But I knew I couldn't go back anymore. I had made my choice, and from this moment on, my life could never be the same. So, all of this was for nothing? Everything between us? Just a mistake? His voice became raspier, filled with a desperate attempt to find an answer that could save us. It's not a mistake, Logan, but it has to end. I clenched my hands into fists, trying to stop myself from crying. I knew that if I started crying now, I would break, and I wouldn't be able to finish what I had come to do. He let go of my hand, and the silence that followed was deafening. I took a step back, feeling how the distance between us became too wide to cross. I understand, he finally said, his voice soft, as if he had come to accept the inevitable. I saw the hope in his eyes die, the hope he had carried for so long. We stood there in the silence, and I felt that this was the last moment we could ever be together. But it wasn't comforting. I turned and walked out, closing the door behind me. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I walked back to the car, but I knew I had made the right choice. Now I had to return to Oliver and my life. The road home seemed endless. Each minute behind the wheel dragged on like an eternity, and my trembling hands barely kept the car steady in its lane. Inside me, a storm was raging, and all my thoughts were focused on one thing. I had to tell Oliver everything. I couldn't live in this lie any longer. I couldn't come home every night, with a heavy heart, knowing I was destroying his trust, his life. Everything had to change today. Today, I would tell him the truth, no matter how bitter it would be. When I pulled up to our house, everything outside looked so familiar. The usual light in the windows, the neatly trimmed lawn. I sat in the car for a few more minutes, gathering my courage, feeling my heart pounding so hard it seemed ready to burst out of my chest. How could I have done this to him? How did I reach this moment? But I knew I couldn't continue living this lie. Inside, all I felt was emptiness and pain. The only way out was the truth. I had to tell him everything, no matter how much it would destroy our lives. Lying further was impossible. I stepped into the house, and everything around me was normal, as if nothing had happened. Oliver sat in the living room, immersed in his papers, not noticing my arrival at first. He looked the same as always, calm, confident, determined. All this time, I had been living in two worlds, one with him and the other with Logan. And this moment felt like the end of it all. I couldn't maintain this illusion anymore. Oliver, we need to talk, I said, standing in the doorway of the living room. My voice came out weaker than I expected, but there was something in it that caught his attention. He looked up, his expression calm, but I saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. He sensed something. The thoughts he had been pushing aside for months suddenly surfaced. Did something happen? He asked, putting his papers down. His voice was attentive, like someone ready to hear something important, but still unaware of how devastating it could be. I didn't know how to begin. How do you explain that you've betrayed someone? How do you tell the person who trusted you more than anything that you've shattered that trust? Inside, guilt and despair were swirling. I sat down across from him and took a deep breath. I've done something terrible. The words barely escaped my lips. They were like knives I was driving into his heart, and I knew that, with each word, it would only get worse. Oliver froze. He didn't move, but I could see in his eyes how his mind started processing what I had said. His calm was only a shell. What exactly did you do? He asked, his voice cold and quiet. But the tension in it was beginning to build. My heart clenched. I couldn't stop now. I had to tell the truth, no matter what it cost. I had to. I had an affair with Logan, I said, and the room seemed to stop. Everything around me became blurry, and my voice felt distant, as if coming from far away. I couldn't believe those words had actually left my mouth. Oliver stared at me in disbelief, as if his mind couldn't process what he had just heard. He was silent for a long time, looking straight at me, and I watched as his face slowly changed. His eyes, usually calm and focused, began to darken, like a storm brewing behind them. What? He asked, his voice hoarse, as if the words were stuck in his throat. It went on for a while. I don't know how it happened, but I can't live in this lie anymore. I'm sorry, I said, and each word struck him like a hammer hitting glass. I could see him slowly breaking apart in front of me. He stood up, slowly, as if in shock, as if he couldn't grasp that this was real. He took a step back, stunned, and then a look of rage filled his eyes. You slept with Logan, my friend? His voice rose, and there was such fury in it that I felt a chill run down my spine. He looked at me like a stranger, like someone he no longer knew. Oliver, I began, but he interrupted me, his voice full of outrage. How could you? How could you do this to me? To us? To our family? He yelled, and there was so much pain in his voice that I could barely breathe. I knew I deserved all of it, but that didn't make his words any less painful. He stepped closer to me, his face tense, his breathing heavy. Get out. I don't want to see you. Get out of my house. His words were like a sentence, and I saw that there was no warmth left in his eyes. Oliver, please. I tried to find the strength to explain, to say something, but he didn't want to listen anymore. No! He shouted louder. You betrayed me. You betrayed everything we had. You destroyed it. Get out. I can't stand to look at you anymore. His words pierced me like icy needles. I saw that his love for me had shattered the moment I spoke the truth. He was no longer the man who loved me. Now, in front of me, stood a man who wanted to destroy everything that reminded him of me. I packed my things in silence, hearing his heavy breathing, but he didn't say anything else. As I left the house, he stood by the window, turned away from me. He didn't even watch as I closed the door behind me. Outside, the rain was still falling, but now the sound seemed indifferent to me. I had lost everything. Everything had changed. My life, once stable and orderly, had shattered like a glass vessel, breaking into 1,000 shards. I stood among the pieces, unsure of how to begin putting myself back together. Oliver filed for divorce almost immediately after that conversation. He didn't want to see me. I couldn't blame him for that. I had destroyed everything we had, and I knew that it was entirely my fault. Months had passed since the day I left our home. Now, I lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the house that once felt like a fortress. I moved here to start over. There were no memories of what I had lost in this place, and it became my refuge, though a very lonely one. Every evening, I returned to the empty apartment, where the walls seemed to remind me of my mistakes. It felt like I could hear my own thoughts too loudly, since there was no one left to fill the silence. Oliver, Logan, they were all gone. I was left alone. This was the consequence of my choices, and I had to learn to live with it. I tried to rebuild my life, but the past seeped into every corner, like an ink stain. I often thought about how I could have avoided this. What if I had stopped myself sooner? What if I had never let those feelings for Logan grow? What if I had chosen loyalty to Oliver? The questions tormented me, but the answers changed nothing. I understood that I couldn't go back. All I had now was the emptiness I had created with my own hands. Work became my only solace. I buried myself in it, clinging to the one thing I could control. My colleagues didn't know what I had been through, and I liked it that way. No one looked at me with judgment. No one knew my mistakes. I could pretend to be normal, even though inside I was anything but. But the nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed and feel everything I tried to forget rush back over me in waves. The loneliness was unbearable. One evening, on my way home from work, I stopped at a cafe on the corner of the street. Inside, it was cozy and quiet, the light softly streaming from the windows, and people sat at tables, talking and laughing. It felt strange. I hadn't been part of something like this in so long. I couldn't remember the last time I had simply enjoyed a moment. Everything felt so distant, as if it belonged to another life. I went inside, ordered a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. Outside, it was raining, the same rain that had accompanied me since that night when I told Oliver the truth. It reminded me that everything had changed. As I sat there watching the raindrops slide down the glass, I realized one thing. Starting over was much harder than I had expected. I wanted to leave everything behind, but that was impossible. My past would always be a part of me, like a scar that would never fade. I picked up my phone and hesitated. Several times I had tried to call Oliver, to apologize, to tell him how sorry I was for what had happened. But every time I stopped, realizing that my apologies wouldn't change anything. He no longer wanted to see me, and perhaps that was for the best for both of us. Logan. I hadn't seen him since I ended things. I didn't know what had become of him. But whatever was happening in his life, I knew there was no place for us in each other's worlds. We had destroyed whatever good there might have been. But here's what I was sure of. I would no longer seek comfort in someone else. I had learned that you can't run away from your problems by hiding behind someone else's feelings. All I could do now was accept my mistakes and move forward, no matter how painful that was. The past had been a lesson. I couldn't change it anymore, but I could change how I lived from now on. And even though I was starting from zero, from this moment on, my life was in my own hands. I took the last sip of my now cold coffee, set the cup down on the table, and stepped outside. The rain was still pouring, but now, with each step I took toward my apartment, I felt a little stronger. The future was uncertain, but I was no longer afraid of it. I had accepted my pain and my guilt, and now, maybe, just maybe, I could finally move on.